Good morning, everybody. I see people connecting, so we're just going to give it a minute or two before, so that everybody can get into the meeting before we start. Mr. Barry, can you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the information session slide on your screen right now? Thank you, sir. So unfortunately, the timing of this meeting seems to be concurring with power outages in several parts of Warren, which is a problem, obviously. So as long as my power doesn't go out, we will have a recording and we'll be able to post it to the district website for those people that might be affected by that. I apologize if we run into any technical difficulties during the hour we have together. But thank you for making the time to be here, and I know some people are on cell phones instead of computers and all kinds of things to make it work with the weather. So unfortunately, I guess that's another one of those 2020 things. We can't plan for all of those things. So welcome. I'm Dr. Mingle, superintendent. We have several members of our leadership team on the call who are going to join in at various points to try to address questions that were submitted ahead of time. The agenda for the hour we have together is to give a brief summary of information, the key information about the reopening plan that was approved by the Warren Township Board of Education last night, which is what we're calling Hybrid 1.0, and the way schools will reopen on September 8th. So I'll summarize a little bit of the information from last night. We will not go through the entire presentation we gave to the board meeting, but for those of you who weren't at last night's board meeting, that information is all posted on the district website. So you can go to warrentboe.org and see last night's board meeting, just the presentation slides, just the graphics, just the videos, whatever information will be helpful to you is all posted to the website. So I'll just do a quick summary, which is also the overview of where to go. There's a lot of information on the district website. This will get the highlights and try to answer the highest priority questions people submitted ahead of time, but it will not get into all of the background details, which you can find on the website, of course. And thank you for everybody for pre-registering. That allowed us to prep questions so that we can make sure that we hit the ones that are most common. So there are probably 4 or 5 questions that we received most. We'll make sure those get answered in detail, and then we'll go through as many other questions we received that we can answer right now. We will not get to every question every person submitted in the time we have, but anything we don't answer today, we will be adding to the FAQs or to future notes. But we're prioritizing questions that we think will help you make a decision about whether or not you're choosing for your child that they stay in full distance learning when we reopen schools, or if you want to send them into the hybrid model. So we'll prioritize those questions. If things come up during the meeting, like if somebody says something and that leads to a follow-up question or it doesn't make sense, feel free to put into the chat your questions. And if we have time at the end, we'll try to get to them. And if not, we'll have a written record so that we can follow up about that. Okay. I want to start with where the video ended by saying that none of us, there's no student or parent or staff member, administrator, Board of Education member, none of us think that the best possible solution to education is to create a brand new school system to open the school year. However, the conditions create necessities in order for us to meet our local, county, state health guidelines, the Department of Education guidelines, and so on. And so we're trying to make the best of a very challenging situation. That's what we're going to walk you through right now. I don't think the video is again. So I want to talk a little bit about the reopening progression briefly. So one of the very common questions is this a permanent answer? Is this the commitment for the whole school district? It is neither permanent for you as you make a decision for your family, or permanent for us as we look at the models that we're going to implement throughout the school year. So we need to start somewhere that we know we can implement that maximizes safety under our current conditions. As we all know, the conditions change on a daily basis. There were guidelines that were issued by the governor yesterday that changed aspects of the plan we're sharing with you today. And so we have to be ready to pivot based on what that might be. So what you can see on the slide here is we've been in full facility closure since March 16th. That was the first day that we were in 100% distance learning. We are going to open the school year in hybrid 1.0, which is students are assigned to one of two cohorts, either a Monday, Tuesday cohort or a Thursday, Friday cohort, and they will alternate Wednesdays. So they'll either go 2 or 3 days a week. The reason we chose that model over some of the other options as far as week over week has to do with aligning with the high school and the other districts in our area, so that families, although this may not be important if you don't have students at the high school, families who do have students at the high school and in the K-8 district, it's much better if we can align those family schedules as best we can. So that is where we'll start with single session days. The exact times can't be determined yet. So one of the things we're working on right now is figuring out with the high school and their schedule where our start and end times will be and how that works for transportation. As soon as we have that information, we'll share it out. But right now we're saying approximately a 4.5 to 5 hour school day, like a normal early dismissal, approximately, but the exact times need to be determined. As you look across the continuum, our goal is to keep moving to the right. As long as conditions allow, and as long as our public health officials tell us it's okay, and as long as our students are able to follow the guidelines for physical distancing and wearing face coverings and everything else, we will continue moving to the ultimate goal all the way on the right of getting back to full traditional, all students are there for a 6-hour and 40-minute school day, just like we're used to from a year ago. Along the way, we'll have different stops where we'll bring more kids back or for longer days. One of the common questions is, how do you make that change? So parents right now are being asked to make a commitment for the opening of the school year. If you would like to change that decision, you'll need to give us 30 days notice so that we can then look at the logistics behind making that change. So I'll talk more about that in just a minute. The other thing I want to mention about this progression is it is possible that we will make changes for certain grades or certain classrooms. So one of the other questions that I'll address later on in more detail is what happens if there is a positive test in a single classroom? It is likely, I would say, that we may have to take a specific cohort or a classroom from hybrid 1.0 into facility closure based on a positive COVID test and vice versa. So we have to be very flexible and understand that these decisions will not be universal and they will be adjusted over time as we go through the school year. Okay. Just want to bring up one thing on the screen here. Give me 1 second. I want to bring up one other thing. Okay, so on the district website is also this graphic, which I know is too small to read the details in the Zoom meeting, but on the website, there's a clickable version where you can zoom in and look at all the details in one place. And we're gonna run through them very quickly because I think they highlight many of the common questions that we're receiving. We already mentioned the hybrid schedule and that distance learning is an option for parents, and you can go back and forth with 30 days notice. One of the most important things we are required to follow under state and CDC guidelines is physical distancing, which is defined as 6 feet. And I know that one of the questions I received was why not a lower number? Because I saw somewhere that maybe 4 feet is enough. The guidelines we've received from our health officials say we must maintain 6 feet physical distancing. One of the things that changed yesterday is the governor issued an order that says all individuals in schools must wear a face covering at all times. That's all students and all staff members. That's a significant change from where we thought we might be. One of the things we were trying to figure out is if there were ways to allow students to take off their face coverings when they were in an assigned location, but under the current orders of the governor, that is not possible. And I think this is a really important point, especially as you're making decisions about what's right for your child and your family. And I said this last night too, I have not personally worn a face covering for 5 hours at a time. And I'm sure that that's the case for a lot of other people. We have to think about how do we get ourselves ready for this? It's a pretty big ask of our staff and our students. We will build in breaks, we'll build in time for kids to go outside, but obviously, we live in New Jersey. We have all 4 seasons. It's not going to be possible all the time to be outside. So we will build in breaks, but kids will have to wear their face coverings most of the day, nearly all of the day. Symptom monitoring, we'll talk about a little bit more later, but you and we will have roles to play in monitoring symptoms. There will be guidance from our school physician and our health official about you attesting to the fact that your child does not exhibit any symptoms of COVID-19 before you send them on the bus or send them to school. And for the same thing for our staff, and then other checking that happens at school. Students in our ABA autism program and our LLD program, and we'll communicate with them separately as well, will be attending in both cohorts in person because of the nature of the services they receive, but all other special education services can be adapted to both in person and distance. We will not be allowing visitors into the schools under almost any circumstances this year. So our school campuses will be essentially closed to outside visitors. Our local health officials are great. There are about 5 in the county. There's one that specifically works with Warren and several of other communities. I meet with them every Monday for updated information about what their guidance is, and I'll share some of that today. We will accommodate students and staff members with underlying health conditions. If you have a significant concern about a student health condition, it's important to get in touch with your school nurse as soon as possible to let them know, especially if there are going to be requests for accommodations of some kind, specifically if there's a request for an accommodation regarding face coverings. So one of the things to consider is if a student or a staff member cannot wear a face covering due to a medical condition, the distance learning option would be preferred. Whether we can accommodate them in person depends on a lot of other factors. So it's important to get in touch with your school nurse if that's something that applies to your family. We will provide time for hand washing throughout the day at all of our schools. This is a pretty significant change for our middle school student where we're going to have to schedule times that a class might go to the bathroom like they're in elementary school or something. But we have to be able to provide time for students to wash their hands regularly. It's much harder at the middle school than the elementary schools because there are not sinks in most classrooms at the middle school. Continuing through, we talked about that students will be assigned to AB groups. One of the questions we keep getting, and I know is very important to you for your planning, is when will you know whether your child is in the Monday, Tuesday, or the Thursday, Friday, because that affects all kinds of other decisions. This is one of the reasons we're asking you to tell us by the end of the day tomorrow which model you're choosing. Because once we know how many kids are in person and how many kids are distant, we can then assign them to cohorts and communicate back to you by the week of August 17th, which is 2 weeks from now, at least which cohort, so that you can make other decisions. If we can do it sooner, we will, but there's a lot of logistics behind the scenes for that. Our ventilation systems already bring in fresh air, but they have been increased. Mr. Pate might talk about that a little bit later to allow more fresh air. You will have the opportunity to waive your right to transportation if you would like to. This is a year-long commitment though, unlike the model. And the reason for that is there's state law that governs transportation waivers, and there are a lot of routing and staffing decisions that go around that. So if you're not sure whether you need a seat on the bus for your child, then you should not waive it. So your default should be, I want my seat. If you know for sure that you'll be able to take care of getting your child to and from school for the entire school year, then in the registration forms, you can waive the transportation. We'll have signage posted about distancing and hygiene practices. I'm going to talk more about contact tracing in detail later on, so I'll skip that for right now. We already have tiered cleaning and sanitization, which has been upgraded based on the CDC guidelines. In hybrid 1.0, because it's single session, we will not have lunch and at the elementary schools recess. Instead, there will be snack and physical activity breaks built in, including at the middle school. So we were trying really hard to keep alive our fall sports season at the middle school. but it became impossible. Most of the other schools that we play had already canceled their fall sports seasons, and so we're not able to run our fall sports. We will be offering after-school activities through distance options, like we did in the spring, and more details about that will come. As I mentioned, we'll have flexibility, and we'll continue communicating about this on a weekly basis, even once school reopens. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kimmick. So basically, I preloaded the most common questions. Mr. Kimmick will address the ones related to instruction. Okay, you should be able to, there you go.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Mingle. So this slide was presented last night at the board meeting, so I just wanted to take a few minutes to just, again, talk about the way the schedule will flow at the middle school and just emphasize a few different areas. Remembering that we will have a hybrid A in person or a hybrid B in person, and those days will rotate. Hybrid A will be in person on Mondays and Tuesdays. Hybrid B will be in person on Thursdays and Fridays, and Wednesdays will actually be the day that every other Wednesday, one of those hybrid groups will be in school in person and one will be distant. It's important to realize in the calendar, there's a note here that kind of suggests again that we will be balancing out the calendar across the year to, again, first of all, designate which days a hybrid group will be assigned to be in school, and making sure that when we have certain weeks that are shorter weeks, that we're balancing out those weeks across the year. So those two cohorts of students will have the same number of in-person days and the same number of distance days. Also really important to recognize with the schedule is that students will receive a schedule this year. So regardless of whether they're full distance, whether they're in-person in a hybrid A or in-person in hybrid B, they will be following a designated schedule like they would in a typical year. So it's important to understand that whether a person is or a student is in person or distant, they will be following that same schedule. And it will be bound by time in the same way that a regular school year schedule is bound by time. We just haven't assigned a time to it yet because, again, that is information that we have to develop and make sure that it works with transportation. But you can see within that schedule that the core areas are addressed. There was a mention of a win period or a what I need period. This is really a recognition again that there will be students that need guided time to work with teachers on areas that would require additional practice. We want to make sure that we recognize that there are opportunities for students to, if they need individual practice, to provide that support at school and have that support available to students. If students need additional challenge, that would be the goal within that time as well. So really just to recognize again that students will have some unique needs potentially coming into the school year, and we want to make sure that that's represented in our schedule. As Dr. Mingle mentioned, there are break times in here in terms of opportunities for movement for students. Also even the idea of, depending on how the schedule flows, having opportunities to be able to go outside and just have opportunities to do things in a socially distanced appropriate way. And then you can see we have to have increased time for just things like hand washing at the middle schools, and things like just transitions in terms of arrival and dismissal. All those things will take a little bit longer than they typically would on a given year. Okay, so Dr. Mingle, can you move on to the next slide? So the question about will all classes be taught? And you can see from the schedule, yes, all classes will be taught. Whether they're taught in person or distance is really what the difference is. So you can see in the schedule, we have world language and we have specials that are taking place at this point, the way we're thinking about it, at home. The idea being, again, that those are things, again, that some of the world language teachers did a really fine job with last year in terms of developing synchronous supports for students. They would represent an increased level of synchronicity over what we had in the beginning of the spring when we had first started distance learning. All right. Okay. So with regard to the next question, what would virtual instruction look like, and what changes are being made to keep students engaged and learning, and how will parents be informed about progress and functioning? So one of the biggest challenges last spring was access to paper-based materials. That was really problematic on multiple fronts, that we could not easily get materials to students, and there was a degree of, I think, holding students accountable for certain types of work that would have been done in a typical year. This year, distance learning and in-person learning strategies will have targeted focus on just having similar strategies used in both environments. So when students are at school in person, and then they go to a distance environment, the expectations will be the same or similar in person as they would be in distance. And that all gets into focusing on how we want students to engage, the idea that there will be live interactions daily, as well as providing meaningful opportunities for students to interact with one another. So the shift this year is really to be very intentional about instructional outcomes and not just focus on the use of the digital tool. I think last year, because of the circumstances that were surrounding us, we had to be somewhat reactionary in the sense that we had to develop systems that were not typical for what we were doing on a daily basis. This year, we can be much more intentional about how we're using the digital tools and also count on paper-based tools to be available for students. For students that are in the hybrid model, as long as that hybrid model holds true, then students will be coming to school 2 or 3 days a week. So there's opportunities for teachers to interact with students, to provide different kind of feedback to students, and also to have a constant flow of paper-based materials, if appropriate, being picked up by students and carried by students. There's also this sense of providing students a very clear set of expectations regarding what their responsibilities are in terms of connections and practice and expectations. So promoting a sense of classroom community and connectedness for students is a high priority this year. There are strong correlations to student engagement and the importance of students feeling connected. Regarding progress reporting, expectations would be that teachers will provide parents updates as they would in a typical school year. We intend to use gradebook as we typically do. We intend to have assignment feedback as we typically would. And again, we will have common assessment information that we'll also be able to provide parents at key points in the year that all students will take part in with regard to just having some metrics to define how students are doing across the year. Okay, Dr. Mingle, next slide, please. If going 100% distance learning, how likely will simultaneous teaching and be as a predominant mode of teaching? Regarding that aspect of this question, the intent this year is to increase simultaneous or synchronous teaching and learning, so it's more representative of in-school instruction and learning. So that's what I'm talking about when we talk about this idea of having continuity between the in-person and the distance learning environment, making sure that there are common practices and that there's a level of synchronicity to both of them. I think it's important to recognize that in a typical year's in-school learning, that is really based on a mini lesson structure that does not last an entire period. So the teacher may be talking to students for 10 or 15 minutes at the onset of a lesson, and then the length of those lessons are really based on developmental ages of students and also on the intent of what the teacher is communicating to the students. So typical in-school lessons always had a follow-up of some type of either collaborative work or independent work taking place. So part of our goal in distance learning would be first to establish the expectations around classroom culture, around lesson delivery, and then to support this type of work as we would in a typical school year. And then as the year progresses, expand capacity for students to have greater ownership and engagement in the learning as well. So there are tools that we can use to do that, like eventually the possibility of breakout rooms within Google Meet, providing students opportunities to collaborate with each other, as well as collaborate and work with the teacher. The second part of this question relates to the intent to provide increased support for parents around addressing routines and structuring accountability for students in the home. One of our goals in August is really to create a set of parent resources to outline how parents can promote and support expectations with regard to attendance and workspaces within the home and understanding of student responsibilities for engagement, and having a consistent message for parents and teachers to be delivering to the student. I think that's very, very important that there is collaborative nature there with regard to students understanding what the expectation is and hearing a very, very common message regarding what that would look like at the start of the school year and as the school year commences. We piloted a number of these strategies in Summer Fun this year. We received some good feedback about how that was transpiring. So again, we do want to make shifts for that, but approach the school year in the same way that we typically would with regard to making sure that there's a level of connectedness there and that students are very clear on routines and expectations and that it's predictable and something that they know how to be accountable for. So next question, if we choose to do remote learning, will we be provided books so that we can help our children, and why are we asked to decide for the whole year and not term-wise? So as mentioned last night, arrangements will be made for families to pick up paper-based materials to support distance learning. So that was, as I mentioned before, a challenge last year that we couldn't have regular access to that. So even students that, if they were full distance learning, we would want to set up systems for parents to be able to come and actually do a pickup of materials that would be needed. We will work out that system and actually communicate that to parents that choose that option before the onset of the school year. As we move forward with that practice, the idea would be that students would also have access to paper-based materials, but they'll also receive a district-issued Chromebook or iPad. The Chromebooks are being issued to all students in grades 1 through 8, whether they're distance or in a hybrid, if they're full distance or in a hybrid, and iPads are being issued to students in grade K for one-to-one access to make sure that again, we can support the work that students will be doing in the home regarding access to those types of devices. And then regarding the immediate decision about distance or hybrid learning, again, this is something that is mentioned within the form, the Genesis form that is going home to parents. We're asking parents to make a decision right now to help us facilitate planning. So at the start of the year, are you selecting full distance or hybrid? So we can actually organize around that. The form does make mention that there is a 30-day notification that the district would require to shift that placement from full distance into the hybrid or from hybrid into full distance. And part of that is just that there's would be a requirement for us to evaluate schedules, evaluate staffing, and make sure that we're able to facilitate that move in a way that doesn't have a lapse in service for students and that they're always supported. All right, thank you, Dr. Mingle.
Thank you, Mr. Kimmick. And Mrs. Lenhart, I think you only have 1 or 2 questions, so turn it to you. Transportation.
Thank you. So regarding transportation, the baseline is that all students will be wearing masks from the moment they get on the bus, so they can put it on at the bus stop. And the routing is really dependent on additional data. Given the district's hybrid model will automatically only have 50% of the students on any given day. In addition, we will possibly have some students who are doing wholly distance learning. And in addition, even those students who are doing hybrid will possibly opt out of transportation. So once we whittle down the numbers, we will then endeavor to create transportation routes which are somewhat even and low ridership.
Thank you. Is Mr. Pate here? If not, I can go to somebody else and come back to him. All right, we'll come back to those questions. We can answer them too if we need to. So I will go to
I will
Mr.
share
Russell.
that Mr. Pate had to deal with a facilities emergency, and that's
Yes.
the delay.
I totally understand. And I can address those questions if that's the case. All right, Mr. Ressa.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Mingle. So the question that I'm posed here is, will students with IEPs receive the same support? And if so, how are we notified? So in terms of the support that students are going to receive, the goal of the Department of Special Services will be that students with IEPs receive the same support provided in their program document as much as the hybrid schedule allows. Students' needs will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis by the IEP team, which includes the parents, to determine the appropriate supports in the present and going forward. I know that building administration, as well as case managers, will be in constant contact with parents, guardians to inform them of their child's program and supports for the 2021 school year.
Oh, you only had 1 question too. Okay. Mr. Villar.
I have 2 questions actually, right? So the first question is, right, about changing classes. So the goal in the middle school is to create a cohort which keeps students in place primarily for their core classes during the day. When we create cohorts at the middle school, we have a couple of academic accommodations in mind, right, in terms of their needs, whether they have an IEP or what is their math placement. The the guiding principle is to place them in a first period class together, and the students stay in that first period class for all the core classes. Teachers come to students, students don't go to teachers, right? So they stay in one room for the majority of the day. The 2 times a day that we anticipate they will leave that classroom, and I think Dr. Mingle, that's actually slide number 2, right, about right, changing classes or moving through the hallways, is when students are on their way to PE, right, because they have a ability to go to a very large space where they can spread out, and on all fair weather days for students to go outside for physical education, right, and take advantage of that, as well as when they need to go to the restrooms to wash hands and to use those facilities. And as Mr. Kimmick pointed out earlier, we're actually building scheduled times into students and cohort schedules for when they would use the restroom, so that they're not there together, that everyone has an assigned time slot that they go to make sure that we minimize how many students are in the hallways. So this also means that we will not be using lockers in the coming year. Students will keep their belongings in their first period class where they stay throughout the day in an assigned space for them. Because we can't have students crowding in the hallways like that. It also means when students arrive at school, they go directly to their first period cohort room, and that's where they're dismissed from to at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Villar. Okay, I have a few here. So one of the biggest ones is what happens if there's a positive case? And so with an important caveat that this is one of those pieces of guidance that is changing rapidly. What I'm going to read from right now is guidance that was submitted to us by our local health official, who actually decides the answer to this question last week. But we were already told that it will be changed later this week. So I'm just giving you kind of the general concept, because I think there's enough that will be common that it'll give you a taste of what the situation will be like. So in a scenario where a student or a staff member exhibits symptoms of COVID-19, and that word symptoms is important. The CDC guidelines are now based on symptoms, not just positive tests. And those symptoms include things that we all know could just be the common cold or the regular seasonal flu. But if there are symptoms, or a parent answers yes on a health screening form about the various symptoms, or there's a temperature of 100.4 or higher, the student or the staff member is immediately sent home. We instruct them to get COVID-19 testing if available. One of the big concerns is that when schools reopen, the testing system is going to fail because all of a sudden there's going to be a huge influx. That's not my assessment, that's our health officials' assessment. And then we have to go through a process to decide who else in that classroom or cohort is at risk for exposure. So that's the contact tracing question. So we are obligated to maintain extremely careful records of everybody else comes in contact with. This is an enormous task. So we need to know exactly who's on the bus and in which seat they're in. We need to know who's in what classroom and what seat they're in. When they go to a different location, we need to know who they're near and who they're not near. All of these are factors for why we have to have 50% capacity in a hybrid schedule, because it's just so much to keep track of and monitor. The definition of close contact from the CDC is within 6 feet for more than 10 minutes. So within 6 feet, regardless of wearing a mask, for more than 10 minutes. So that's really, if we can keep kids apart by 6 feet, which is our intention, we will minimize the amount of impact if there is a student or a staff member who has a positive case. So that's if there is a student or a staff member exhibiting symptoms or with a positive case. If somebody has a family member in their home who has a positive case, only that student or staff member is quarantined, not the other people they had contact with. So it's only the person who had close contact. So if a student's parent, let's say, has a positive case, that student goes home, that student may be recommended to get tested. That's not determined by us, that's determined by the health department. And that student will be quarantined, even if they test negative for a full 14 days. So if there's a case in a house, the people who live in that house will be quarantined for 14 days by the health department, which means that that student will have to go to full distance learning for those 2 weeks and not come to school with their cohort. As you can already start to see the complicated nature, because we're going to have cases pop up all over the school district where one student has to be quarantined or half a class or whatever else. In the case where a student or staff member has an actual positive test, not just symptoms, but a positive test, student or staff member is sent home if they're not already home. The student or staff member must isolate for 10 full days from the time they first had symptoms, and until there's 24 hours straight with no symptoms and no medication. So one of the very common challenges we face is with fevers in schools, right? So kids get fevers all the time for all kinds of reasons. The CDC guidelines say That's a symptom of COVID-19, even though it's most likely not COVID-19. We have to treat it as if it was, based on the CDC guidelines. What happens if we think a student might have something, but then they test negative and they're asymptomatic? If that happens, if a student or a staff member goes for a test, they test negative and they don't have any symptoms, they can come back to school once they've gone 24 hours without there being a symptom. And what about if actually, let's see, student or staff member test negative after routine testing, meaning they just went for testing with no symptoms, then they can come back right away. So there's some people who are just going for testing just because they want to know on a regular basis. If that's not because there was a symptom or a concern, then there's no other quarantine action. As you can imagine, this is very complicated. Our health department is creating a chart that we can share with you by the opening of school so that you can basically say, if this happens, then this is the response that'll happen from the school. The other big question related to that we get with everything from lice to the flu to COVID-19 is, are you going to tell me about other people? We are not legally allowed to reveal personal health information. What you will find out is if there is a case. So basically, if your child is in a close contact situation, like there's a positive case or a suspected case in their classroom, the health department decides how you're notified. We will not be publishing like some big chart on the website that says we sent 4 kids home at the middle school this week. That's not what they're recommending that we do. So it's a little bit long, but you can kind of see the iterations that that's going to go through. We already talked about, oh, sorry, this is a different question. Will there be, if a student is enrolled in remote learning, distance learning, is there an opportunity for them to meet face-to-face with some of their staff? As of right now, the answer to that question is no. So if you choose full distance learning, that means full distance learning. You're not coming to the school facility, and we're not in a situation where we can set up other kinds of meets. That might, if the conditions change and we can allow that, maybe we will, but right now, the sort of welcome back to school kind of activities and experiences will be virtual if students are in the full distance learning experience. Given that there is at least 3 to 4 weeks until the first day of school, with data changing daily, will the board consider an even more revised plan prior to September? So I wish I could say no, that this is definitive, but as we all know, the conditions, some of them are out of our control. I can tell you that we will not make changes to the opening hybrid model unless we are ordered to do so by the governor or the Department of Education. So this model that we're sharing with you today is the way school will open. If conditions change, if the governor announces something else, then we have to respond to that and adapt our plan. But this is the plan for opening, and then we will constantly evaluate. We're thinking on a month-by-month basis whether we can make changes across the continuum once we're reopened. We talked about being able to switch with 30 days notice. I already mentioned why the 6 feet, not 4 feet. Sorry, everything froze for a second. Oh, actually, that's my last question. Let me go back to Mr. Pate's questions. Mr. Pate, are you on the call? If not, I can address.
I'm here.
Oh, perfect timing. It's all you.
Okay, so cleaning of the restrooms is going to be as the rest of our facilities currently, with a daily disinfecting taking place after the students leave. We are still addressing how frequent we will be doing it during the day. That has not been decided yet. So the ventilation systems in all our buildings currently bring in outside air. The current district standard was to bring in 10% of outside air, exhausting that 10%. We're going to be upping that to between 20 and 25% to bring in more outside air into the classrooms.
Those are your 2 questions for today. Let me just make sure that I didn't miss any at the end here. Okay, those are elementary school questions. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat box. Anybody else from the leadership team have questions they saw in the chat that they are able to address right now before? I haven't been able to follow them along while I was presenting. Mr. Kimmick?
Yeah, there was a question about the curriculum and delivery of curriculum. So the intent is to have an approach that would actually have us enacting our regular curriculum, we may have to make some adjustments in certain areas that involve sharing of materials, like in the sciences, but our goal is to actually, again, enact a curriculum the way that it's presented and written. So that's something I think that parents realize, and the expectations for distance students, if they decide to go full distance, and for students that are in hybrid are the same. You know, we're expecting students to kind of maintain the same progression of curriculum across a week, across a month, and across a year or a marking period. And it's important that sense of like what that expectation is around learning is the same for both sets of students.
Other administrators, any other, Mr. Villar?
But to follow up on what Mr. Kimmick was saying, and there was a question in the chat about the combination or what will students in distance learning, will they be able to follow what's happening with the students who are in-person learning? The way we've designed the cohorts, what we're working to do is we basically take a first period class, we split it into an A and a B. And that is, as Mr. Kimmick mentioned earlier in the presentation, students still have a period schedule, a bell schedule that they follow, so that the teacher creates a mini lesson at the beginning, right? That would be for students who are both in person as well as students who are distance learning. And that it'd be possible for students who are at distance to access what's happening in the classroom, maybe partner with or talk with students who are in person learning. So that there is a sense of community about that whole group meeting. That is the goal we're working toward.
I'm fine, yes. The only point.
Thank you, Mr. Villar. Sorry, I'm just scrolling now. Mrs. Lenhart, and then Ms. Mensinger. Ms. Lenhart, you want to go first?
There was a question about bus cleaning procedures. In accordance with the CDC, both our district drivers and our vendor, Dealaman, is working to both clean and disinfect at a minimum of once a day. And we're looking at the possibility of increasing that, but the CDC requirement is once a day.
Ms. Mensinger?
I just have half, so will there be a tour of the middle school for incoming sixth graders? I know Mr. Villar and I have talked about making a video, just kind of talking and walking everyone through how we're going to enter the building and the process for that. So I don't know that it will be live, but at least we will have a virtual version.
Okay, and I see there's a couple I could jump in here. There's one about face coverings and what kinds are allowed. So we are obligated, as you know, a local school district is really an arm of the state government. We are obligated to follow the executive orders of the governor. So the question is, can students wear a face shield instead of a cloth face covering? The answer is no. So face shields are not replacements for cloth face coverings. We'll make sure that information from the state gets out to everybody, but a cloth face, it could be the gator style. It doesn't have to be, a face mask that goes over your face that way, but face shield does not replace the need for that. Students can wear both if they want, which protects in both directions, but it does not replace the cloth face covering. Mr. Kimmick?
There were some specific questions about the WIN period. I just want to mention part of the literature that we're looking at for successful return to school is establishing first an understanding that students may have some areas that created deficits or needs for challenge kind of going into the school year based on experiences last year. The other part of that is really building in some student goal setting with regard to like what types of goals should the student be working toward, and to empower students to understand that they should be working toward improving in these different areas. So really defining that for students. So somebody asked a question of, would the teacher define that or would the student define it? Based on some of our assessment data that we'll be doing at the beginning of the school year, we're going to want to create some individualized goals for students and provide opportunities and time for students to be able to work toward those goals. That's that connection, I think, also between the home and the school environments, to make sure that students understand their role and their own efficacy in terms of making progress and owning that progress a bit. So that WIN period is really has some multiple purposes regarding that. The other question that somebody asked, will teachers be teaching to in-class and remote learners at the same time, or will the classes be divided by learning distance? We do see an opportunity for crossover between at-home students and in-school students because the technology and the access to the technology will be the same at home and in school. And the other piece that people have to, I think, recognize is that the in-school experience is going to look very different. If we're saying that students have to be 6 feet apart and social distance to a certain extent, we may have to rely on some of the strategies that we use at home for students that are also in school. And that makes people uncomfortable, I know, and it's not always the answer that we want to hear, but in-person school is going to look a little bit different as well. So I think that some of those tools that we have available to us can provide continuity for students in both environments, but also provide some opportunities for interactions in a way that would be very positive for students who are at home and at school being able to connect. Because I know that's a concern that people have around the pods. You know, if they're totally separate and a class is split to two hybrids, how do we connect those groups together? So that's part of that focus as well.
Mr. Kimmick, can you also address the questions about the live streaming versus other models of how the at-home, what the distance learning will look like?
So it'll be a combination. The experience in the spring, remember, we didn't do a lot of live streaming. We were gearing toward that. We started doing some of that in terms of office hours when we were talking about the spring. The expectation this year is that we will have live streaming of mini lessons, but it won't be the idea that a teacher is putting a camera on and we're just live streaming the whole class. The literature really suggests that's not an engaging way for students to actually access learning. So our expectation would be that if a teacher is doing a lesson with small groups of students, that it may be that the teacher is actually delivering a mini lesson or a strategy lesson to 5 or 6 or 7 students that's very targeted for those students. So there would be a combination, I think, of asynchronous kind of explanations supported also by mini lessons and strategy lessons that teachers are delivering. But the intention is not to just put a camera in a room and again, have a live stream to the room, because that's something, again, where the nature of work that students do is that they would be watching students working independently sometimes. Really what we want to target on is that mini lesson or that start of the lesson that provides a new learning for students, and then students move on to either independent practice or some type of collaborative work or work with the teacher.
The other thing I should have mentioned at the beginning that I forgot to is that in 2 weeks, on August 17th, there will be a specific presentation at the board meeting, which will then be available on the website the next day on Tuesday the 18th, about all of these distance learning specific topics. So we have teams of teachers working in the month of August on developing the models and procedures and examples and exemplars of all these things. So we'll be able to share more detail then as well. Mr. Resta, you had some questions to answer?
Thank you, Dr. Mingle. So there's a few questions in the chat that I would like to answer here. Bear with me one second. I was going through them. First one was about in-class resource. The intention is to have, just like the IEPs are written, I think I said that before, programs are going to be delivered as close to the IEP document as possible. So for those settings, we'll have that co-teaching model, and the special education teacher will be a support and a resource during the distance learning as well. There was also a question about 504 accommodations for students that have a 504 plan. That also will be addressed, where students will receive their accommodations and supports that are through those documents, and that teachers will all be aware of the students that have those plans and will be able to support students in that area. Let's see, there was another question about programs. Let's see here. And I think in terms of the support, I know the WIN period, I know Mr. Kimmick talked about the WIN period being a support period and used for a variety of measures. I know that will be an available support time for students that especially have those learning differences, will be able to have some time to be supported by their teachers, as well as through a consultative support in the distance learning model as well. When students are home for distance learning during the given hybrid week, teachers will be able to check in, touch base with students and things of that nature. Thank you.
Okay, a couple other things that I can address. There's a question about siblings. Our default expectation is that we're assigning siblings to the same cohort. There are a lot of complicating factors if there are students in very specific programs that may be only able to be offered because there's only a few kids in that program. For example, our geometry class is very small. We might have to think about where that falls. But generally speaking, siblings will be assigned to the same cohort. They can also sit together on a bus. It's important if they're at the same school. So that's one of the exceptions to the spacing on the bus that we have to follow. If there's somebody who wants children to be in different cohorts, the best bet is to reach out to the building, to the school counselor, to Mr. Villar, Ms. Mensinger, and let them know that. But our default would be that they would be in the same cohort. And then there's questions about how are we going, what are we going to do for people who don't comply with the regulations? As you all know, this is something that the state of New Jersey hasn't figured out the answer to. We need your help over the next month getting the kids ready for these expectations. This is going to be extremely challenging. And personally, I started wearing a face covering at times where I normally wouldn't. Like if it's 100 degrees outside and I'm taking a walk, I wear it because I need to get used to the fact that this is something I just have to get, make normal. I don't envision us saying that we're sending them down to Ms. Mensinger for detentions. What I envision is if a student is unable or unwilling to follow the safety guidelines, that you will need to bring them into distance learning. Because we need to keep everybody safe, right? This is like the highest community-based shared responsibility thing we're probably ever gonna face. And if there are students who are unwilling or unable to comply, we might have to think about whether in-person is the right place for them. There's very little guidance from the state on how we handle these sorts of things from the New Jersey Department of Education. We would love to see everybody in person. And that might be the best place for me to close here. It has to do with how you make the decision. So I know it's really difficult on August 4th or 5th to know what you're going to think on September 8th, which is the first day of school for students. If you're unsure of what you think is best for your child, I would recommend that you select the in-person hybrid. That should be your default, because it is much easier for us to take a student out of the in-person model and put them into distance learning if you change your mind than the other way around. So my recommendation, if you're unsure, is to think that way. I also think that everybody has to make their own parenting decisions, but I think middle school kids are old enough to have an opinion about this. And I think it's important for them to understand that what in-person schooling will look like is not what they remember it looking like when they left last March. And that's really difficult. I shared this story last night where I recently went somewhere that just reopened and they wanted to take a picture of me there. And it took me until after that picture took place to realize that they had no idea whether I was smiling or not. Our kids are not going to see the emotion of their teachers and vice versa on their face. I mean, it's going to be, in-person is actually going to be more restrictive to students than when they're at home, because they're going to have a face covering on. We're going to have to, middle school students, the transition from 6th to 8th grade, as you know, is enormous in how students mature and how they rebel against things like other people telling them what to do. And we are going to have to tell them that we're going to treat them like they're much younger with much fewer freedoms. And I've done focus groups the last couple of years with middle school students, and the number one thing they say they love about the middle school after their teachers is that they have more freedom. And we're going to take that away. It's really challenging. There's no easy answer to it. Obviously, our hope is that we're going to reopen in this model and that it's going to get looser and looser as the school year goes on. The public health conditions around us are going to get better. We're going to learn all kinds of lessons from the schools around the country opening right now that are going to help us be even better prepared a month from now. But I fear that we're all seeing the data, it seems to be going in the other direction, unfortunately. So, we have to be prepared for all of that, and difficult to predict, and I understand how difficult of a challenge that is for your families. Just see a couple more questions that popped up here about, question about substitute teachers is an unanswered question right now. So there's conflicting guidance. Some places recommend we don't even use substitute teachers, that we try to figure out ways, to think about staff members who might be teaching at different times. Are there ways, it might be possible that we have to move a cohort into distance learning if we can't cover a class. That's possible. There's a lot of concern. Substitute teachers who work in Warren also tend to work in surrounding communities. And every time a person goes to another setting with another 30 kids, it increases exponentially the potential exposure. So we have to weigh these things. There's a question about daily surveys of students' health. There will be guidelines about what has to happen before students come to school each day, coming later in August. Collaborating with the high school as far as the schedule, yes. So one of the reasons we made the final decision about our model is because it's the same one as Watchung Hills. I can't promise that we'll be able to get every family on the same schedule because there's a lot of considerations, but we are trying to align with Watchung Hills as best we can. And I agree with that last comment about it's really important that we have a solid plan for distance learning. And that is the month of August focus. So as you are probably aware, most of our staff that work in public school districts are 10-month employees from September to June. Last night, the Board of Education approved us bringing back a portion of those employees in August so that they can be working on these things. We also pushed the start date of school back by 1 week for students to September 8th, which gives us an entire week with our staff on protocols and distance learning and all the other details there. Any other administrators and just so you know, so I probably should have said this when I introduced each person. The administrators who spoke to you today are also leaders of district return to school subcommittees. So Mrs. Lenhart leads our operations subcommittee, Mr. Kimmick, our instruction subcommittee, Mr. Ressa, our wellness subcommittee, Mr. Pate, our facilities subcommittee. You didn't hear from Mr. Riegler, who's our technology director. He leads our technology subcommittee. There's a ton of information available on the work that's happening in all those committees, and I thank them. And Mr. Villar also serves on operations beyond being the middle school principal. We will get the recording of this session up on the website as soon as we can. We have another one that starts in just 30 minutes or so, but we will get it up on the website as soon as possible so that those that want to go back and rewatch something can do so. We will also be updating the frequently asked questions page on the website with many of these questions in the next day or two as well. Mrs. Lenhart?
I see some questions here regarding the calendar. Did you want to direct to the calendar approved last night?
Sure. So yeah, the board adopted a new calendar last night, which changes the start date for students to September 8th. If it's not up on the website yet, it will be very soon. Most of that adjusts some of the days off throughout the year as well, because we took days that were professional learning at other times of the year and moved them to the beginning of the year. It also pushes back the last day of school by a few days. However, we assume that that the state is going to say that on a snow day, you can use distance learning tools and not actually use a snow day. And if that happens, we'll be able to push back forward the end of the school year, if that makes sense. It's one of those things that's an unanswered question. And finally, again, I know that there are a lot of additional questions. We're answering as many as we can as they come in. Some of them are unanswerable, but we're working as hard as we can to get them to you. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. I apologize if you had any technology issues with the weather. I know while we were talking, it looked like the tree in my backyard was about to fall down, but we're okay right now. So stay safe, and we'll continue updating you every Thursday afternoon. Thanks, everybody.